This is a review of The Road to Oz, the evolution, creation, and legacy of a motion picture masterpiece. First of all, I've got to give a big thank you to authors William Stillman and Jay Scarfone, as well as publisher Rowman and Littlefield for supplying a review copy of this book, as I was very excited when I heard that Scarfone and Stillman were doing a new Wizard of Oz book. I've previously done reviews on their 3 earlier books on the Wizard of Oz, and if you haven't read any of those books or even seen the reviews I did, I think it would be really helpful to take a look at those first before this review, as it'll give a lot of context for what we're going to talk about for this review. Obviously, unlike their other books, this one is not like a visual coffee table book. There are some really great pictures. So many of them have never been published in any Oz books before. Although I think it's just as important for us to go through these books as it is with visual books, just so you really understand what to expect from this book. Also, this version I have here is an advanced reading copy, so it has uncorrected page proofs. So if you choose to get a copy of the book, it may look slightly different. Most noticeably, though, will be that the actual book is a hardcover. Also, it is available as an ebook version if you're into that sort of thing. This probably should not be the first book you read about the making of The Wizard of Oz, and that is my number one favorite thing about it. This book does something that I really can't say about a lot of books, is that it has absolute respect for the real fans of this movie. When I first saw the book was coming out, I was really skeptical because I thought, what else can possibly be said about the making of this movie? Is this just another rehash of the same stuff we've seen and read elsewhere time and time again? And so I'm just so glad that that's not the case at all. Scarfone and Stillman really seem to respect the idea that the people reading this, like myself, probably have already read that stuff, seen documentaries, things like that. And I think that's a really brave thing to do, to have something that is of real benefit to sort of top tier fans, rather than just trying to create something that has the broadest possible audience appeal. Because if you want an introduction to the making of this movie, there are already tons of great books. I've done reviews on most of them, and the various DVDs and Blu-rays have wonderful documentaries about the making of the movie. But they're all sort of Wizard of Oz 101, whereas this is kind of like the book you go to when it's time to start your graduate studies, when you want to widen and deepen your understanding and appreciation of the making of this movie. Which is why I wouldn't recommend this as the first book you read on The Wizard of Oz, because the way it's structured may potentially be frustrating if you don't already have a good foundation for the sort of a roadmap for how this movie was made. Because I don't believe this book is designed to replace any of the pre-existing books on the making of this movie. Instead, I feel like it's made to augment them, to expand on what's already been done, to go deeper into a lot of the details. And the way that the authors have done that is through some pretty extraordinary scholarship. Most of the information in this book seems to come from newspapers at the time, Hollywood trade journals, magazines, more obscure biographies. And I think that shows why books like this are really important, because 99.99% of Wizard of Oz fans simply aren't going to have the time, money, resource, availability to get hold of and scour these vintage periodicals just to find, that one paragraph of text that has some really great information relating to the making of the movie. So we've got Scarfone and Stillman sort of doing that on our behalf, finding these tiny puzzle pieces hidden around, and then sort of assembling them together in this book so that we get a more full, clear picture. And so even though I've referred to this book as being sort of scholarly or for the most hardcore fans, you really shouldn't let that intimidate you, because this isn't a dry, heavy textbook. Yes, there are tons of names and dates, and it is information-packed, but you shouldn't let that intimidate you. It should excite you. I was so surprised how much I enjoyed the content and style of the writing, because I was so sure that, okay, sure, they've probably found, some few tidbits here and there of new information about this movie, and it's just going to be padded out with stuff we've already read or just sort of useless pontificating. But I'm so glad that skepticism was completely unwarranted, because even though the text is very dense, I use that word as a compliment, because it's also so lean and lightning fast. There's nothing overly superfluous, there's no meandering on behalf of the authors. Even at those points when the book does sort of veer off track a little bit, it's still never boring. It's all great sort of Golden Age Hollywood history and trivia. And because the writing has such a no-nonsense, cracking pace, it means that by the time you turn the page, it'll be back on track anyway. And for a book that is, almost 400 pages of pure text on a subject matter that already has been covered so thoroughly in the past, this really was such a huge surprise and delight. So let's just sort of quickly go through the actual contents of the book. So I think my recommendation that you should have read another Making of the Wizard of Oz book first is actually proved sort of straight away when you pick up this book. As in the first 50 pages, the movie is barely mentioned. So if this was your first exposure to the making of this movie, you'd be like, what has this got to do with the Making of the Wizard of Oz? But what those first 50 pages are is essentially breakdowns of the plots for adaptations of The Wizard of Oz prior to 1938. And I knew that this story had been adapted to film and stage previously, but I had no idea how many there were. So the authors basically break down the plot, starting with Baum's novel, then moving on to the various stage musicals, radio programs, silent films. And the way this relates to the movie is that it's basically them showing you how this story has been adapted and changed and influences the MGM movie, because it would be a mistake to say that that movie is solely an adaptation of Baum's novel. And so as they go through the plots and history of these adaptations, the authors are pointing out areas of possible inspiration that the movie drew from for things that weren't actually in the original book. Also, this is probably the most entertaining section of the book, just because some of the ways that people have adapted this story over the years are so wild, some really interesting ideas, but also some really hilarious and bizarre things as well. So then the second section is the largest part of the book, and that is basically what you would think of as the traditional making of. It's the casting, the sort of whole production up to the premiere. And I was genuinely amazed how fresh all of this felt, even though I've read about this production umpteenth times. There was no sense of reading something that I already specifically knew, because obviously history hasn't changed, so the events and the different areas of production, things that went into making this movie, you will already know about from having read other books. The difference is this book takes those events and views them from a slightly different perspective, which it does through the use of these new anecdotes and quotes, details, facts, which really helps avoid the sensation of reading something you already specifically knew. And also that no-nonsense style and speed of writing that I mentioned really contributes to that as well, because it means that you're not necessarily getting like a complete report of the entire production, because again, I get the impression that the authors are trying to spare longtime fans a trudge through the exact same content you've read time and time again. Instead, this is about offering shorter, quicker information on each of these subject areas, but with the idea being that it's just expanding on what you already know, or offering some new little details or an anecdote. Additionally, you will often find a bit of an emphasis on myth busting. If you've seen some of my other reviews on Wizard of Oz books, you'll know that sort of misinformation and rumors have plagued the sort of history and legacy of this film. So it was great having the book set the record straight on certain things. And when I say new information, I really do just mean sort of rather small details that the hardcore fans, I think, will appreciate, because I know I did. It's not like this book is presenting some sort of new shocking revelations, like they found some birth certificate that proves Judy Garland gave birth to a Munchkin love child, or anything like that. And so then the last section, which is about 50 pages, is about the legacy of the movie, because it's important to remember that the history of a movie doesn't end with the premiere, especially a movie like this, which owes so much to its television broadcast history and its role in popular culture. And I really liked that this wasn't like the authors inserting themselves, sort of like waxing lyrical about the legacy of Oz and how important it is, which is something I hate reading about in books on movies, when it's kind of like almost like fan essays in a way. Instead, this is just about the facts and the history of the journey of the movie after the premiere, as well as the cast's involvement with it over the course of the rest of their lives. And then at the very, very end, there is one of my favorite parts of this book, an extensive bibliography, so you can really get an idea of where all this information is coming from. And one last thing that I am a little hesitant to mention is that even though I love the choice of images in this book, the reproduction of the images is not very good. Now, that very well could just be because I have an advanced copy of the book, so I hope that's just mine, and that the images in the actual book are reproduced in a higher quality. So as we approach the 80th anniversary of this movie, it's a really good time to be a fan of The Wizard of Oz. I mean, it's always a good time to be a fan of The Wizard of Oz, but I just think it's so fantastic that all these years later we're still getting a book like this that can create new ways for fans to deepen their appreciation for this very beloved and important movie.